Hello, welcome to the first webinar. I'm Nilam Banks. I'm the Strategic Stakeholder Manager at the Greater South East Net Zero Hub, and welcome to our first episode of Making Net Zero Happen. This is a cross-local Net Zero Hub webinar series, and the aim for these sessions is to share insights on policy changes, central government updates, and accelerate your journey to net zero. We're also hoping to share learning on how other authorities have overcome these challenges and share their lessons learned, and ultimately share how we as a local net zero hubs can support you in your journey. So just going through the slide, this is our whole slide. We're kind of rushing through this bit while everybody else is joining us. Please do introduce yourselves in chat. There's about 90 people that have signed up, so it'd be great for us to get to know who's on the call today. Please do stay on mute throughout all the presentations. There is an opportunity for a Q&A right at the end. If you do have any pressing questions, please do use the chat function for that also. And also all the recordings and slides will be shared post-event. So yeah, this is the first of a number of webinars, and today your host is Steve Baggs, who's the Net Zero Programme Lead at the Greater South East Net Zero Hub. So Steve, would you like to jump online and take control of your slides?
Thank you very much, Neelam, and a very warm welcome to everyone. And yeah, what looks like going to be a very exciting and interesting day on heat network zoning. I'm Steve Baggs. I'm the Net Zero Programme Lead at the Greater South East Net Zero Hub. Got to try and shorten that at some point. But I've been very much leading on heat network developments and trying to build a portfolio and develop a pipeline of heat network projects across the Greater South East, and latterly doing a lot of work around heat network zoning with my colleague Emma Jane, who'll be speaking a bit later on. Right, I'm just going to take control and we'll move on to our agenda today. So, like I say, we've got a number of speakers, and we've put in quite a lot of time for question and answers, sort of 30 minutes towards the end of the webinar. So, Neelam's given us a very warm welcome already, taken us through some of the details. If there's any questions, please put them in the chat. But like I say, we've got plenty of time at the end. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the hubs and the work we do. And then Alistair Silverman from HNDU is going to talk about what is heat network zoning and what should local authorities consider. And then we've got Joe Kalins coming from Leeds City Council, project manager there. He's going to talk about some of the heat network zoning at Leeds, probably a little bit about the Pipes project as well, I should imagine. And then Emma Jane Danielson from the Hub is going to talk a little bit about how all the hubs across England can support you with heat network zoning. And then, like I say, plenty of time for questions afterwards. So, the local net zero hubs, who are we? What do we do? Basically, we are funded by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero. We're hosted by local authorities, so 5 across the hub areas. We personally are hosted by Cambridge and Peterborough Combined Authority, and we follow their governance going forwards. So what do? We provide free and impartial strategic technical support to local authorities, public sector organisations like the NHS, Blue Light Services, universities, and community groups in England. And we very much get involved at the early stages of maybe sort of looking at a strategic case, looking at feasibility potentially, and then trying to build up to a business case or an investment case for delivery. We very much work, like I say, across a whole wide range of public, private, educational, third sectors, and we try to build partnerships to be able then to take projects forward and deliver investment. And, you know, we're very much trying to kind of really deliver projects. That's what we're about. So what are our aims? Pretty much trying to increase the number, the quality and the scale of local projects being delivered across the region. We're also looking to enable local areas to try and attract public and private finance for projects. We work with a range of agencies, including the National Wealth Fund, look at sort of innovative ways of financing projects and supporting a number of different clients. We raise awareness of the opportunities and the benefits to local people and local projects. So we very much work in the community energy space. We have the Community Energy Fund that we've been giving out funding for over a long period of time. And there's an element here of supporting and coordinating collaboration, building knowledge, sharing knowledge, and actually making people aware of the opportunities. And in that vein, very much today, we're raising awareness and sharing knowledge around heat networks. So I'll stop there in terms of the work that we're doing around the hubs, and we'll start very first of all with our first speaker today, which I'm very pleased to announce is Alistair, who's come from HNDU to talk to us about what is heat network zoning and what should local authorities consider. So Alistair, if you're happy to take the control, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks very much, and good morning, everyone. As has been said, I'm here from the Energy Department in central government, where we design the policy and the legislation for zoning, and we also look after the development capital schemes, which you may have heard of, such as the Green Heat Network Fund and the Heat Network Efficiency Scheme. So, but if you haven't had the excitement of zoning and heat networks in your life yet, don't worry. We're going to go back to basics. And if you do already know about them, this is a good opportunity to test your knowledge. So hopefully the slides moved on and you can now see heat networks today to 2050, but if not, tell me no. So at the moment, heat networks only provide about 3% of UK heat. And we're aiming for that to rise to at least 20% by the middle of the century. We do that because the Climate Change Committee and all the fancy modelling shows us that's going to be the cheapest way to get to net zero, as well as a more convenient way. Now, why is it so much cheaper and why is it so much better? Well, there are many different factors, but one of them is that by building heat networks, you can unlock large-scale renewable and recovered heat sources. So that could be all the heat that comes off an energy from waste plant and at the moment is let into the atmosphere. It can be heat generated in the tube in London, for example, that you have to use air conditioning for. It can be heat from data centers, whatever the form of the heat source, and that can change over time. It can be the man-made examples I've given, and it can be natural ones such as rivers and mine water. You can harness it once you have a heat network. Aside from the direct benefits of the heat network and it being more efficient, we also have wider system benefits. So a major challenge we face in transitioning to net zero is that we need a lot more electricity in basic terms. And we need to get that electricity from places it's generated, like the North Sea and wind farms, to places it's consumed, like the towns and cities that you all look after. And that involves cost, both building the extra generation, transporting it over long distances, and distributing it locally. Now, in very simple terms, a heat network needs a lot less electricity than other net zero solutions in order to service the same amount of heat. So you reduce all those electricity costs, and that's called broader system benefits. You can tell civil servants were very creative with all these snappy names. And heat networks are, they've been doing yoga, they're very flexible. So in the middle of the night when no one's using electricity, but the wind's blowing and the wind turbines are making electricity, heat networks can build up all that heat, a bit like an old-fashioned Economy 7, but in a much more efficient and exciting way, and then use that heat when electricity is expensive and in demand. Such as the morning when everyone's having a shower. So those sometimes people forget why we're doing all of this. It's not so I can talk to you with passion about heat networks. It's because it's going to make everyone's lives cheaper in a net zero economy and easier. There's also a great investment and growth opportunity. You know, that's a major government aim, and I know it's an aim for any investors on the call and any local councils. It's predicted that there's between 60 and 80 billion investment potential and jobs that could come from the sector. So this slide is just reiterating and reminding me to tell you that it's going to, that I've talked about how heat networks work and why they're so great, but we're the zoning team. So zoning is all about, if you imagine those factors that make a heat network great, you want, in short terms, a lot of demand near a lot of sources, a lot of supply, because that way you don't need to build as big a network, you've got more economic certainty, and that's where heat networks provide the lowest cost route to low carbon heat. So I'll give you two very extreme examples. I'm sat here in sunny East London. I can see out my window lots of homes and businesses. They're all the demand. I can also see a canal. I can see some sort of power plant in the distance. I can see refrigeration units. They're all those heat sources I talked about. They're near each other. It's a lot cheaper. If I think about where my mum lives in the countryside, which is probably a bit gracious, but she lives in sort of middle England, then there's a lot of detached housing, a lot of smaller homes, but a lot of green space. So they might be more accustomed to using air source heat pumps. But what we're focused on is using data rather than just me looking out the window, as nice as that is. So we have, as I'll show on the next slide, this map on the right-hand side is what our model, our computer model is thinking about. It looks across all of England, because when I talk about zoning, we're only talking about England. It's a devolved policy. And it takes those factors that I've talked about into consideration and maps out, oh, here is a great place for a heat network. I can see all these heat sources, all this heat demand. I can test the price of that. I can test the cost of the other solutions. And then it identifies all the orange where we have identified heat network zones. And then we want to hand over to local communities. You know, it's a very local issue and we want zoning to be locally led. So in central government, we will do this zoning. We will do the identification of the areas. We'll provide the legal framework. We'll provide the guidance. And then we want to empower local areas, local councils, local government institutions to become the coordinators of that development. As I said, civil servants, very creative people with their names. These local coordinators are called zone coordinators because they will coordinate the borders of the zone, where it will be, the competition to pick who will develop the zone, either company that will build the heat network, and then they will make sure that everyone holds up their end of the bargain. What do I mean by that? Well, if the developers said they're going to do certain things, the coordinator will hold them to that. And on the other side, if there are buildings that are expected to connect and are expected to give access to their heat sources at a fair economic price, the coordinator will ensure that happens. So the investor has confidence they'll be able to make those connections and sell the heat and connect to heat sources to generate the heat. And the buildings on the other side will have certainty that the heat network will arrive, better than I can say that word, will arrive when they said, providing the quality of heat that they said. And heat sources will also have the certainty they'll get a good price for any heat they provide. And you can see the slide talks about this. Sadly, I'm not reading directly off the slide. I know people will really love that in PowerPoint presentations, but instead, I'm talking about how we're giving local community tools. We're giving certainty to investors to drive that capital into the market and promote that growth. And yeah, this will in effect allow large-scale strategic heat networks to be developed across the country, saving everybody money and providing heat, which is always nice. This is just going into the exciting detail of the legislative timetable, which I will talk about. We brought forward the Energy Act now 2 years ago, as you can see there, and we're bringing forward secondary legislation, which will provide more details and legal certainty. We consulted on our proposals for this last year, and we're looking to publish that government response to the consultation to provide those details as soon as we can. We've already published some of these maps that you can see on the right-hand side here. The Central Authority, which is the team within DESNZ, the Energy Department that will ensure national delivery of zoning, will publish more of these maps. Now, why is that important? So you as investors know which zones are going to be developed in which order, and you can prepare, and you as local councils can also know. We call it the pipeline, for a little pun, because it's a heat network. And there'll also be lots more guidance information available online as the central authority becomes live. So that was a lot of information, and for some of you it may have made sense, but some of you not. So just so we're clear, this is examples of how the heat network could work. These are all our potential customers. I understand there might be some hospitals on the line as well, and you'll have net zero targets, and you'll have large heat demands. You'll have a large campus potentially to fulfill. You might already have a system of delivering heat across that campus. You might have a little building with lots of gas boilers or boilers in the basement, and that delivers heat all around your campus. A heat network provided at district level can plug into that very easily. So this is what I talked about. Not only is it great for net zero, not only is it great for cost savings, we want this to be a user-friendly experience and not complex, because we know you have many other competing priorities. So we have a hospital there, schools and education, public buildings, all these different things. Anyone who wants heat can plug into a heat network. The other great thing about a heat network is they can provide heat at a temperature that is similar to already provided by an internal gas boiler. What do I mean by that? You may have heard that air source heat pumps sometimes provide heat at a consistent but lower temperature, and therefore you need to change the radiators or other heat transmission systems within your building. District heat networks generally don't need to do that. So that's another cost saving and also FAF saving. That's the technical term. So this is our town. All the green is people buying heat, using heat. And in the red is the suppliers of the heat originally, the heat sources. And as I said at the start, this could be a range of different ones. We've just got some examples here. Water treatment. So when the water's been treated and is clean, it's warmer because it's been through a system, and you can draw that heat out in a more efficient way than just using air. Data centers, we know there's more and more of them. Often they have to do cooling. Rather than paying for cooling, you could sell the heat, so you kill two birds with one stone. Many other examples. Now, this section, I imagine, will be, it will be of interest to everybody, but especially to those who are wondering how any buildings in their portfolio might be impacted by zoning. So to provide that investor certainty, we can require some buildings to connect. First thing I should say is the whole legal framework is the backstop. Most of the time, we're very confident that commercial arrangements between a developer and whichever market entity will be reached, because we want it to make economic sense. We want it to be convenient to the consumer. We only want to use these requirements as a backstop and to provide that certainty. So new buildings, if there's a zone in place and a district network in place, you'll be required to connect, but you'll be aware of that from when you plan the building. Existing communally heated buildings. So that might mean you've got a heat network within your building already. Maybe you've got a gas boiler in the basement and you've got heat delivered to pipes to different flats. That would be required to connect because it's an easy plug-in solution and it will be cheaper and easier. And large non-domestic buildings, because again, they will face net zero targets and they can plan for this. They will be required to connect. Now, it's not one day you're going to knock at the door. It's a very long process of over a year, and you'll be given plenty of notice. So, and the details of this, our initial proposals are in that consultation, or you can wait for the government response, which will set them out in more detail. The second section is exemptions. So there may be a reason why you can't connect when you've been required to. For example, you've already installed a low carbon system, or it may be prohibitively expensive for you to do it because we know buildings are all very unique. We also have exemptions around national security, for example. The list goes on. Again, see the proposals, we'll see our government response when it comes out. So this is the next steps. As I mentioned, we've already, well, I didn't mention this actually, sorry. We've already got 6,000 cities in the advanced zoning program, and they're pushing forward with their networks. We are aware of other local government and private developers pushing forward with networks, which is very exciting, and they are all being thought of in the new legal framework. We are looking to publish the government response to the consultation as soon as we can. And we want Heat Networks, you know, to be a great part of net zero and to be a benefit of all. You can read the much more schmoozy bullet points at the end there, which, yeah. The last thing to say is you may, if you work in local council, you read the news, have seen some stories about a very small number of heat networks which don't provide good value and good customer service. And you may also, walking into this, think networks like the water network or like the electricity network or even the rail network are a monopolistic market, meaning that, you know, you only have one network built and therefore one supplier, and therefore consumers face limited choice. To counter this, in following recommendation from the UK's Competition Authority, we have legislated to regulate the entire heat networks market. When I say entire, I mean inside and outside of zones, so you don't need to be zoned. And I also mean it covers the whole of the UK. Zoning is devolved, but market regulation sits at a higher level. Ofgem, as the energy regulator, is now regulating the heat network market, and we'll be bringing forward a framework which we're working with to ensure standards. The last bullet point talks about the technical assurance, and we're going to widen the support for consumers, working with the same bodies that provide support in gas and electricity. I'll stop there. I've seen some questions pop up in the chat. There's our general email. I'll try and answer some of the questions in the chat now, and then I think I'm going to hand over because we have questions at the end.
Lovely, thanks, Alistair. Yeah,
okay.
we'll answer the questions in the chat later on. Really interesting. Waiting for the response eagerly around the consultation and the next steps. So it'll be really interesting. But that was a really great overview and some of the issues there around heat networks and the opportunities. So thank you very much. I'm now going to hand over to Joe. Joe Kalins, our project manager from Leeds City Council, who's going to talk a little bit about heat network zoning in Leeds and probably around about the Pipes project as well. So, Joe, are you okay to take control of the slides?
I believe so, Steve. Yeah, have I got the ability to just jump forward as I see fit, have I?
Absolutely. Yeah, you should be able
happy
to.
Days. Nice and easy.
Okie dokie. Lovely.
Super.
Thank you.
All right. Cheers, Steve. And yeah, thanks all for inviting me today. I'm Joe Callan. I'm project manager for the district heating team at Leeds City Council. So here to talk a little bit about what's been happening in Leeds over the past few years and then how it ties into zoning policy that Alistair's introduced. So I will kick off with some Leeds context. Appreciate Q&A is probably where the real benefit will be for people. So I'll try to get to that as quickly as possible as well. So just kicking off really looking at the current network in Leeds. So we in Leeds have built out our Leeds Pipes heat network over the past 7 years over 3 main phases. So the network takes heat from the energy from waste plant in East Leeds. We've got 20 megawatt of heat available there, pumps that heat into the Saxon Gardens Energy Centre, at which we've got 33 megawatt of gas boiler backup, and then sends it out across about 30 kilometres worth of pipe work across most of Leeds city centre. So we've connected up that kind of full range of buildings that Alistair mentioned. We've got a large number of public sector buildings, so council, civic quarter buildings, offices, gallery, museum, etc. St James's Hospital, colleges, offices, multi-storey flats, social housing tenants, etc. And then in the last couple of years, we've branched out to start to connect a lot more private sector buildings. So in green, you can kind of make out some residential blocks where we've got private and student buildings connected as well. So yeah, as Alistair mentioned, just demonstrates that any type of building can connect to these networks. So the network at the moment is wholly owned and operated by the council, and it's a kind of 65 million pound worth project in terms of what's been invested thus far. But what we've got coming up in the context of zoning policy and some grant funding that we've received is kind of new scales of what we're looking to kind of achieve over the coming years, really. So in parallel to the continued development of our network that sits north of the river, we also identified a couple of years ago an opportunity in our South Bank area within Leeds. So this is a scheme that's been built up over a couple of rounds of HNDU funded feasibility. And that feasibility then took us through to an application to the Green Heat Network Fund in kind of September 2023. That funding was successful, and we're now going through commercialisation of the project. And really what we're trying to tap into is the regeneration focus for Leeds now is in this area of the city where there's an awful lot of brownfield land ready to be developed. What we are looking to do with this scheme is access additional heat sources. So we're looking to connect into a glass factory identified here. We're looking at water source, sewer source heat pumps, potentially, as well as electric boiler backup. And then interestingly, what we've also managed to do is secure a bridge crossing with some pipe work in it, which will ultimately mean we can interconnect this South Bank scheme with the Northern network. And that resilience element with multiple different heat sources is one of the kind of main benefits to district heating, and one of the things that comes through really strongly in all the conversations we have with prospective customers is something they're particularly interested in, particularly based on the fact that all of that resilience and energy generation is sited off-site from their main development, such that they can use that space for more valuable activity rather than hosting a load of air source heat pump kit on the roofs where they could put roof gardens in and such like.
Joe, just before you progress, I've taken control of your slides. They're on advanced zoning program. Just let me know when you want to move on.
No problem. Sorry. Advanced zoning program, something that we've been doing in parallel to the development of that South Bank scheme. So working with the team at DESNZ and their consultancy team at Arup, they've developed effectively what will be one of the first schemes to come forward for procurement for a zonal scale opportunity. As Alistair mentioned, I think there's six cities on the programme, and Leeds are one of them. And what effectively this does is take that GHNF scheme, increases the densification of buildings that are actually connecting based on which ones will be mandated to connect via the policy, and build up the business case based on that. And this is the kind of opportunity that we're looking to originally go out to market with. Just skipping on to the next slide, which is city centre wide, just to then put into context the kind of scale of the work being done around what a wider zonal scale scheme could actually look like. This is the work that's been done again by Arup in parallel to the work they've been doing on the advanced zoning programme, which demonstrates the size of a city centre wide scheme, which is fairly intimidating, it's fair to say. And ultimately, just to kind of talk about how the kind of capital element builds up on it. We've got a £60 million scheme we've taken 7 years to build, which is already fairly extensive, we like to think. That kind of South Bank scheme that was on screen before is another kind of £60-70 million scheme. You add zoning within just that area and that becomes a £200 million scheme. And you add zoning to a city centre wide scheme and that becomes a £2 billion scheme. So that scale of investment is something that we're fairly obviously as a council going to need to look to alternative sources of funding to council borrowing and grant funding to be able to deliver, and that's something that we're kind of cracking on with, and I'll come to in a moment as well. So I'll just skip on to the next slide. So outside of that city centre zone, again, just to put into some context, the kind of scale we're looking at with zoning, these are then the wider zones that, again, DESNZ through their national modelling outputs have identified as being the locations where heat networks are expected to be the kind of the best, cheapest, most commercially viable decarbonisation solution. And ultimately, at the moment, our focus is really on that city centre zone, but there will be huge opportunities across the entire Leeds district, up to kind of 25, 30 odd zones. Once the policy's in place, that we'll be looking to kind of try to influence as well from within the council. And just onto the next slide. So just talking through a little bit of our the approach that we've taken as a council on the zoning side. So currently, as I mentioned, our focus in terms of procurement is on that city centre zone and how we procure that opportunity. And that's what the advanced zoning programme is kind of got us looking at. So looking at some of the detail on the issues we've actually worked through recently associated with that city centre zone, as I mentioned, as the numbers start to come through, kind of showing the scale of capital investment, it was quite easy to get a decision that we as a council won't be able to borrow that level of money. Looking at hundreds of millions potentially compared to what we've borrowed previously, which has been around 30 million over 7 years. So we're now looking at a new approach for the council, where previously we've wholly owned and operated the network, but ultimately we now need to involve the private sector. And really, with an investing partner, we are looking at it from the perspective of they're actually financially incentivized themselves to optimize and deliver the network too, which can also have its advantages. So through the kind of standardized templates that DESNZ have published that will be used for all of these zonal scale procurements, we've then landed on the golden share option as the best solution for us. So the joint venture option expects a financial contribution from the council. The fully kind of ESCO private sector model just hands it over to the private sector, and then golden share lands in the middle a little bit, where the council has reserved matters, mandatory requirements for the development partner to be able to meet and retain some control over really key issues such as social value. So there's requirements we have in there, or we'll have in there when we get out to market, around things like carbon factors for the network, how quickly they'll build it out, areas they'll focus on, amount of heat demand they'll have to meet. But obviously, as a council, the social value element of it is something that needs to come through very strongly in the procurement, and that's something that the standard tender documents give flexibility for. So we'll be retaining a lot of control over how kind of supply chains are developed, how jobs and apprenticeship opportunities are presented within the local area. What we've also obviously kind of had to do at the moment, as Alistair mentioned, we're waiting for the consultation responses on the policy currently, is kind of procure an opportunity without there actually being the policy in place. So the current strategy for Leeds, which hopefully by the time most people on the call get to the point of procurement, the policy will be there. But for us, we're kind of procuring that South Bank scheme as the guaranteed opportunity. You know, we've got GH&F funding that will hand over to development partner to kind of enable that opportunity. But there's no guarantee at this stage when we get out to market that they'll have zonal rights. So we're kind of demonstrating the potential scale of the wider zonal opportunity, and that there's an expectation that when the policy comes in, they will be conferred zoning developer rights such that they've got exclusivity to develop in that area. But there's just that kind of slight nuance for the council at the moment to work through. And then, yeah, also worth just mentioning that we obviously operate a network ourselves within that city centre space. There's also a new network developing further east in Leeds off another energy from waste plant, and both of those networks we assume or hope will be conferred rights to be the zone developer within their area. So you've got this interesting scenario where there's a large city centre picture with two networks already existing within it, and the need to kind of shape the best kind of boundaries or areas that we think the networks can grow within, without necessarily impeding on our own ability to expand. So again, just a little bit of a complexity that the council's working through currently. And then, yeah, beyond the city centre, there's limited capacity, yeah, as I say here, to really give those wider zones much thought at the moment in terms of how we'll build up the pipeline, and how we will kind of determine the ones that are most appropriate to focus on. But ultimately, the way the policy is shaping and the way it's expected the private sector will be involved, it will be kind of private sector led to an extent. Really, the private sector will steer those areas of growth in the early stages. They'll be predominantly the ones we expect that will be financing the schemes, and it'll be the areas with the best rates of return that they focus on in the immediate term we kind of expect. And then just on the final slide, I just wanted to touch on this really briefly, really, because it won't be super relevant to most people on the call. And zoning is obviously on a complete different scale to what's been delivered previously with heat networks in this country, not compared to other countries where they've proven it's completely viable to deliver at that scale. But Leeds has had some policies of a kind of a similar ilk on a local level since the project started. So we established early on in the project a local development order. Within that local development order area, it set two elements. One is that we were granted permitted development rights wholesale within that space. We don't need to apply for full planning permission every time we extend the network or every time we connect an individual building to the network. And then also this policy at the top that's mentioned, EN4, basically means that within that area, this policy applies, and all development over a certain size, I think it's 20 dwellings, has to consider district heating as part of the energy strategy for their site. ultimately they have to consider whether they can connect to an existing network, whether they can develop their own, and if neither of those options work, they have to future-proof for a future connection to district heating unless they can prove it's completely unviable for them. So that policy for us has worked incredibly well. It's encouraged a huge number of conversations with people, and I just want to kind of include it to show that our experience has been that a big challenge in bringing people, well, the big challenge is bringing people to the table in the first place to consider heat networks. Once you're in that conversation with them and they understand how it works, they understand the benefits from our perspective, we sell it as low carbon, affordable and reliable. Those are the three main strands. They understand the benefits from a carbon resilience and affordability perspective, which is usually what's driving their decisions. Once they understand that, it can be quite an easy sell. So zoning, again, as Alistair said, provides that kind of backstop. Ultimately, it's hoped it'll be exactly that, a backstop, but the fact that the policy will exist will bring people to the table. And as I say, that really is half the battle. And if you can get them to the table, you can sell the benefits of district heating, and then ultimately the expectation is they will want to connect as they have been doing in Leeds over the past few years. And I will hand it back there to Steve.
Thanks, Joe. That's really fascinating. Just the level of investment, the way that you're approaching it, the planning policy already in place and how that affects local authorities. So we'll come on to that, no doubt. I'm conscious of time. We are running a little bit late, but I'm going to hand over now to Emma Jane, who's going to talk a little bit more about how the hubs can support some of this heat net zoning work. Emma Jane. Emma Jane, we can't hear you. I can't hear you, but is that the same for everyone else? You want to try again?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, I'll start again. So I'm the Heat Network Engagement Officer based at the Greater South East Net Zero Hub, and there will be one of me in all the hubs eventually. I think there's 4 in post now. We are, it's a role funded directly from HNDU, and it really is a supporting role directly with the Heat Networks engagement team based in the Heat Network Delivery Unit. Part of our role is very much sort of providing that link between the local operations, what's happening sort of down on the ground, and that sort of national policy and those objectives, which is sometimes you can feel there's sort of a little bit of a vast distance between them. But we're strategically based at the hubs for a number of reasons, and the most important reason is to take advantage of all the excellent relationships and the connections that the hubs have with local authorities and public sector organisations, but also so we can tap into that sort of technical knowledge. And when we have conversations with local authorities, we can then signpost them on to sort of the next steps in potentially developing a heat network of their own. So I'll just go a few very quickly. I'll rattle on because we're a little bit behind time, some of the key activities. So a big part of my role will be that awareness raising, a lot of what Alistair did today, but much more at sort of a local level, down on the ground. So I can support local authorities, with selling the story of a heat network, sort of raising awareness, the how and the why and the what of heat networks and heat network zoning. A big part of that is knowledge sharing. We sort of can connect with the AZP projects and sort of talk to sort of managers like Joe right in the thick of it and sort of get some of their insight and feedback. And then we can pass that sort of information on to those projects not quite as advanced as there are, but who are sort of looking forward at potentially getting to that zonal stage of delivery. Another sort of insight we're doing is a lot of intelligence gathering, really sort of, and this is that feedback, that direct feedback with sort of local operations up to DESNZ around sort of the barriers that local authorities are facing, but also sort of opportunities in their areas and sort of making sure they're aware of those. And bearing in mind that different local authorities, have different opportunities and sort of not all of them, for example, will have, really good sources of waste heat available, and they'll sort of have to look at more sort of localized options such as canal water, for example, and sort of air source heat pumps. And then you have issues like grid capacity. So it is quite a complex landscape, and it's very, very different when you get down to that local level, and sort of looking very closely at sort of what you have available in your area and sort of the appetite as well. Two activities we're supporting with is the digital zoning platform that was mentioned earlier by Alistair. And I think this is a really exciting part of the consultation results. And when the modelling outputs are sort of launched, the possibility that everybody will have access to the site and they can sort of really deep dive into heat network zoning and find out more sort of what's going on in their area, down to sort of anyone can sort of look on that website, developers and local authorities, but also any public sector and communities. They'll be able to see if they're in a zone, if a zone is being developed, if it's being designated, and all those levels that are going to sort of be sort of followed on as this policy goes live. And also sort of talking a little bit around the zoning coordinator function with local authorities, sort of finding out sort of what their appetite is to sort of have that function within them, within their councils embedded, or whether it needs to be more of a strategic level. But really noting the concerns around that kind of not losing that local connection, really. For the hubs, for example, we have a good oversight. We have that technical support, but we're not local enough to really provide the sort of the benefits that having a zone coordinator on the ground will. So this has all been fed back for engagement with local authorities to DESNZ. So I'm hoping that's going far. And just very quickly, I've just put a few things to sort of look out for before zoning arrives, before it becomes live. And this really does depend sort of on your heat network maturity, where you are in your projects. And if you're very much at the beginning, and I suggest really sort of just doing an energy review and sort of really understanding your energy needs. And that can be at a building level. I know this at NHS are on the call, and some universities having heat decarbonisation plans, sort of knowing you know, sort of the standards and the limitations of your buildings already before zoning goes live will be really useful, and sort of being aware of that potential to connect or sort of requirement to connect in the future, and sort of being on the same page as that upcoming policy and ready for that. And then sort of looking at sort of that identifying your opportunity areas in your strategic zones. You might know this already, but when that platform, that digital platform goes live, you'll all be able to see exactly where those opportunity zones are and the strategic ones, and then you can start to sort of have a look closer at the viability. I won't go through all of these now, but I just want to mention the education piece. Really is important that you start this early on. And the minute you know you have an opportunity area or a strategic zone, I think you need to be on the ground raising awareness and educating your local sort of communities and everybody in that zone of the potential of a heat network being developed in the near future. And this will help you later along when you develop that project, and when you ultimately go to consultation before designating a zone, everybody is already aware. I'm just going to really stop there because I understand the time. You'll get these slides.
Yeah.
Two other quickly, the two
Emma
other
Jane?
slides.
Emma Jane,
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna just halt it there. We'll pass the slides on, I think, to people
Yeah,
around
okay.
funding and the
Just some
finances.
funding
I wanna
and
leave it.
resources there.
Great, we'll pass those on because I want to have some good time for a conversation now. So I'm going to stop there. Emma Jane, we'll pass on those resources and the support that we can give. But I want to really now open it up to the question and answer session. So if we can now move on, and if anyone's got any questions, we've got some questions in the chat, but let's start. If there's anybody who's got any questions right now, can we take those? If you'd like to raise your hands. Okay, Mark. Got a raised hand, Mark Holmes.
Hello there, can you hear me?
Yes, thanks,
Yes.
Mark.
Right, okay, just a quick one really. Thank you for that, really informative. I just wondered if there was any research into the fuel poverty indicators or benefits thereof of the employment of heat zones in different areas.
I'm gonna ask Alistair and Joe to put the cameras on, and I'm gonna point towards them for any information on that question. Joe, Alistair, be interesting to hear from you, Joe, as well. Alistair, do you want to start? I'll point that to you.
Sure. So, my analytical colleagues would be very angry if I said we had clear and explicit research on that before I checked with them. So I'm not going to say we do, but I do know that, a heat network in zones, it's about 20 to 30% cheaper to join the district heat network than to use an individual air source heat pump on average. And that's a levelized cost of heat. So that's inclusive of everything. So we know that it's going to be cheaper directly to the consumer. As I talked about, we're going to have huge savings through the electricity system, meaning their avoided costs. Now, hand on heart, how we monetize and transfer those avoided costs to make sure everyone benefits from this transition is still a pending policy question, but we're aware of it and we're working on it. The other point I would make is that we are going to, the framework for the heat networks and zones will ensure the prices are fair and good and will be continually checked. So I can't give the firm details on it yet, but that would mean that all consumers are going to not be ripped off, for want of a better phrase. We appreciate that local councils have a big interest in ensuring their social housing tenants can live with dignity and heat their homes and bathe themselves at a reasonable cost. And there will be an option for those local councils to add that into the development of the heat network, to put that in their shopping list when they're picking the developer. We also have to balance that with the investors and the developers' interests, that they can't be delivering heat at a loss to certain buildings because it doesn't work out on the economics, and we don't want to build it into the system that would mean that developers won't bid for areas where there's more social housing or will avoid social housing connections. So we've got to get that balance right. But overall, yes, we want the heat to be affordable, and we're aware of the current situation. The last thing I'll say is central government, before I pass over to Joe, is that there are many different tools in the Energy Department's box for solving different issues, and heat networks will be aware of these issues, but we work with other teams who focus explicitly on fuel poverty and improving social housing and other stuff. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Joe, anything to add on the Leeds example around fuel poverty?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's more of a kind of policy and national modelling question, which Alistair's covered anyway, but just briefly touched on it from a Leeds perspective. We've connected 2,100 flats across our council-owned multi-storey blocks to the network, predominantly social housing, a few leaseholders in there as well, and all of those benefit from cheaper rates. Exactly the percentage cheaper that we are, I'm unsure, but our housing team say that we are cheaper than their alternatives, and that's why they've been keen for us to continue to connect more and more of those buildings. And we know with the regulation coming in, there'll be additional protections around price caps and regulation of heat networks moving forward outside of just local authority operated schemes as well.
Thanks, Joe. Simon Davison, would you like to ask a question?
Hi there, yeah, Simon Davison, Colchester City Council. It was just Emma mentioned that about local authorities and their appetite for becoming heat network zoning coordinators, and I can certainly speak for our local authority that I think strategically we're probably best placed to fulfil that position. However, financially we're in nowhere. We're not in that position to fill that position. So I wanted to know an idea what kind of level of support is going to come centrally to support that role.
So I can't give explicit details on the funding for zone coordinators and how that will exactly work on this call, but we will be releasing details on that. And whatever approach we take, we know that local councils are really stretched, but we know that they're crucial partners. So there has to be the level of support and the level of expertise to empower them to take on this role. Otherwise, it's not going to work. But I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly today how that's going to work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew.
Good morning. I'm from Preston City Council. I'm just wondering what DESNZ's view is on the local government reorganisation in terms of, should we be looking at this now before we get sucked up into a bigger council, or is it better to wait a little bit before the once the new councils are formed. Do you have any views on that?
So we are working with our colleagues at MLCLG about their package of English devolution, which I think is sometimes also referred to. I mean, there's no reason to delay. Obviously, you all know your circumstance better. From our point of view, no, we want to see networks built as soon as possible. With all the other constraints and the delays on our side on releasing information and doing stuff like that, but there shouldn't be a reason. When it comes to how it will work in areas where there's many layers of council, we need, it's location based. We'll need to look at what each level of the local government wishes to do and why it feels it's best to do that. Because ultimately we want the network to work for local people and to be delivered in an efficient way. So before the formal setting up of the zone coordinator role, we will alert each level of local government, and they can opt in and opt out and say which parts of the role they want to do. So it's without your specific concerns, it's hard to know, but if you have them and it's about a different part of the framework, then do use that email address I put in the chat. But know that there shouldn't be any. Obviously, that the system will look different, and that's MLCLG's policy area on how local government will run after that. But from our point of view in zoning, it shouldn't. It won't change. Obviously, it'll be more slick. MLCLG making it more slick, but yeah.
Okay.
Cheers, thanks.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and I know certainly in the southeast that's a big question around devolution and what might come with potential strategic authorities, how the funding might work. Lovely. Okay, let's move on to Stuart Lane.
Yeah, hi, Stuart Lane. I'm with University Hospitals Dorset, and got two separate questions. One is, I mean, obviously working in a hospital, we know about having redundancy. Have backup heating sources should our main source fail. But how does that work in the lights of, say, the Leeds network? How much redundancy is built into the network if one of the heat sources hits a problem? Is there a level of redundancy that you would expect a heat network to have, and what does that look like? And my other question is around access or leverage. We discussed that buildings under this can be forced to connect or have to have some net zero alternative. But what about land and access to land for things such as geothermal? Is there anything within this that would require land to be accessible for geothermal? So if, for example, you've got a patch of land that's due to be developed and it's got good geothermal potential, is there anything within this that would require a developer to allow the well to be developed prior to building on top?
Right. Okay, thanks, Stuart. First question, I think I'll hand over to Joe, and then second probably is more Alistair, I would say.
Lovely.
Joe?
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, thanks for the question, Stuart. So there's two layers to it, I suppose. There's redundancy at the network level, which from our side, there's 20 megawatt available from the energy from waste plant, and then we've got 33 megawatt available from our gas boilers. Energy from waste plant is typically down for 4 to 5% of the year for planned maintenance. And other than that, the gas boilers step in. And beyond that, all of the connection designs allow for a connection point for a containerized boiler. So if there were to be an outage on both the energy from waste plant and the backup gas boilers, then they could be brought to site by the contractor. Our aim is to build on that resilience. Ultimately, we don't really want to be using gas boilers at all if we can avoid it. And we're looking at additional decarbonisation options, such as that interconnection with the southern network, and then exactly what you mentioned, kind of geothermal as an ambition at one stage, as well as additional heat pump capacity. But beyond that, network level redundancy, at the hospital itself, our contractor has worked with them on their kind of site-wide strategy, such that we provide them with a 4 megawatt connection, I think it is, and then beyond that they've got CHP, air source and water source heat pumps working, and all of that works kind of in tandem on site. How exactly all of that interfaces, the technical side of it, way over my head, but I understand that it does work and works fairly effectively for them. But we're just part of a much broader strategy for them, rather than us being the kind of the single point of supply.
Thanks, Alistair. Second question.
Yeah, I mean, just sorry, I will go to the second question. Just to add to what Joe said, I mentioned the market framework, the general regulatory framework, so that will provide consumers of all sizes, domestic full to huge hospitals and businesses, with the security that any dropout in supply would be compensated for. I mean, it shouldn't be happening because of technical things. We also build flexibility within the future design or the requirements of district level to have that gas plant that Joe talks about in their example. So although it's low carbon, that there can be gas backup because of maintenance or other things failing. We also, in the third place, look to contractual arrangements that any business offers in business to business sales. If they don't fulfill an obligation, the penalty that they'll face or what they'll do to cover it. So although we want to provide regulatory clarity and drive towards net zero, we also want the system to work. So but it sounds like they're already doing that in Joe's example, so that's good. On the access, so you gave a very interesting example of land access in terms of what we would frame as heat sources. So you mentioned that buildings, consumers would be required to connect, and the other end of the system where we're using heat sources, how can the access be obtained there? So there are two main things I would say. First of all, the local coordinator will have power to request information from suspected heat sources, and will have powers to enforce a connection of that heat source, and will also have guidance to ensure that the economic terms agreed are profitable to both sides. So no one's going to be, put in a position that's not suitable. The example you gave is a bit difficult because you talked about a sort of open area of land or undeveloped land, and there was geothermal. So those powers would apply there. It's a heat source owned by somebody. If you were talking about somebody wanted to build on it, so they want to build housing, but then there was heat source identified underneath, I think the coordinator would have to look at the trade-offs there. Maybe this housing or this development is more important than the heat source, or could access still be given to that heat source as well as the development? It's hard without the specifics. The other thing I would say is, I talked about the market framework just now, the general regulatory thing. You'll be aware that statutory undertakings, regulated industries have rights and powers. So an electricity, gas, telecoms companies can enter land, lay pipes, inspect, cross transport land. And that's because these developments are important for everybody, so they should have special rights compared to, say, me just building a house, which is also important, but different level. We want to give heat network developers the same level of legal status and the same rights to be able to access land and all those other powers, because they're another key utility. And that will give clarity to everybody, it will give investor confidence, and it will ultimately lower costs for consumers who will be connected to that eventual network.
Sorry, thanks, Alistair. I'm just conscious of time. We've only got a few minutes left, so maybe a couple more questions. Casper, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to ask about cooling. So government's projections show an increase of maybe 3 or 4 times in the national cooling load in the coming decades. The sort of magnitude and speed of that is potentially a bit uncertain, but it's likely that the heating load will decrease in that time. So the kind of relative balance of heating and cooling load is likely to shift into the future. From my background's in ground source, so I'm kind of used to balancing heating and cooling loads sort of as my day job, but I haven't heard a lot about the cooling load and kind of what you're doing, I guess, potentially locally in Leeds, but potentially also more widely. I guess, have you quantified the cooling loads? Have you projected them to the future? How they're going to be addressed? Obviously, it's great to have a heating system that doesn't have any impact on the electricity grid, but then if everyone has to go and buy an air conditioning system, that's going to impact the electricity demand in the summer. We might end up with a higher summer peak than a winter peak. So yeah, just interested on your thoughts on that.
Alistair, do you want to start, and then Joe come in?
I mean, those are you raised very important points, and around the increased use of electricity as the temperature of the planet is going to heat up. Although the Energy Act refers to cooling in this space, I don't lean on cooling, so I can't speak to those challenges. We do know that some of the heat networks can, as you said, can provide cooling services as well. But I can't speak to the details on cooling. I don't know, Joe, if you're going to save me here and say you've already solved it, so that would be great.
I wouldn't get your hopes up for that one. No, I think I will need to jump off in a moment for another call, but I'd just say that in Leeds it's not yet emerged as a particular issue. We are in conversation with a few office blocks as part of the South Bank development, and we understand that they're able to provide alternative solutions for the cooling load without it causing them huge issues. Again, without a technical or engineering background, a lot of the work on the connection side is being led by our consultancy team at AECOM and then at Arup. But if it is something of more interest, I can take that away. And if there's any other questions in the chat that have been missed or that I'll miss when I jump off now, then also happy for them to be shared across, and we'll try and pick them up either from a council side, or we can ask our consultants for some input as well.
Thanks. I'm conscious we are right at the end, and there's quite a lot of questions in the chat, so we'll try, between all of us, we'll try and answer some of those, I think, going forward. We are come to the end, and I just need to hand over to Neelam, but before I do that, can we just thank Alistair, Joe and Emma Jane for their contributions today. I think it was really interesting what they had to say, and we'll follow up where possible. Neelam, over to you.
Yep. Thanks again to everybody who contributed towards this, especially the speakers, Emma Jane, Joe and Alexander. I just wanted to say that this is the first of a series. If you do have any suggestions for future themes, please do just shout. We will use your feedback from your registration forms, and we will get the answers to any questions that we weren't able to cover in the chat. So please look out for the post-event email that will have the recordings and slides and all the links that we shared during the session. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a lovely day.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.